In June 1997, someone made a discovery that would haunt the community of Hudson Township, Michigan for decades. On June 26, 1997, a worker performing routine maintenance at the Garnet Lake campground stumbled upon the remains of a newborn infant girl while emptying a septic pit. The grim scene was unlike anything the worker had encountered before. Without hesitation, they immediately alerted the local police authorities, setting off an investigation. When the officers arrived at the campground, they quickly secured the area and began their initial assessment of the scene. The investigators carefully examined the location, trying to piece together how an infant could have ended up in such a place. The question on everyone's mind was the same: whose baby was this? The detectives treated the case with urgency, knowing that time was critical in identifying the child and uncovering the truth behind the tragedy. An autopsy was performed on the recovered remains, and findings revealed that the infant was term or near term, with an estimated gestational age between 36 and 42 weeks. This meant the baby had either been born full term or just days away from it. The discovery brought both clarity and heartbreak. A life that had barely begun had been abruptly and cruelly ended. Despite thorough efforts, the investigators faced immediate obstacles. There were no identifying materials found with the remains, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual, and no records linking the child to any missing newborns in the region. With so few clues, the police decided to refer to the unidentified infant as Baby Garnet, named after the campground where the body was found. Throughout 1997, the detectives continued to work tirelessly, following every possible lead and interviewing residents in the surrounding communities. They sought information from hospitals, clinics, and local families, hoping someone might recognize signs of a recent, unreported birth. Each attempt, however, ended in disappointment, and eventually, the case went cold. In 2017, 2 decades after the discovery at Garnet Lake Campground, the investigators decided to reopen the cold case. Advances in forensic technology, particularly in genetic genealogy and DNA analysis, offered new hope for solving the mystery that had long remained unsolved. The detectives began collecting and re-examining evidence, determined to trace the infant's lineage, and finally uncover the identity of the mother who had remained hidden for so many years. By 2022, progress was made when forensic experts successfully developed a DNA profile for the infant. Using advanced family lineage tracing methods, the investigators were able to identify genetic connections that eventually led them to Nancy Ann Gerwatowski. The investigation was significantly aided by a DNA test taken by a half-niece of the infant, which matched the family bloodline to the suspect. The breakthrough marked a turning point in the case, linking Nancy to the newborn whose remains had been found 25 years earlier. Nancy was born in 1964. She eventually settled in the quiet town of Newberry, Michigan, where she began to build her life. In 1997, Nancy's life changed forever with the birth of her child. When questioned, Nancy first denied, but then confirmed to the authorities that she was, in fact, the mother of the infant known as Baby Garnet. When the detectives brought her in, Nancy asked for an attorney but was told none were present. When the detectives asked if she still wanted to speak with them, she allegedly said, "I guess, yeah." She then admitted to the detectives in a recorded interview that she was going through a divorce when she got pregnant and was not sure who the father was. She said she hid the pregnancy and went into labor while home alone. She was subsequently arrested and extradited from Wyoming back to Michigan to face charges. During questioning, Nancy provided a statement to police regarding the circumstances surrounding her child's demise. She spoke about her experience in 1997, mentioning that she had considered an abortion and had not received any prenatal medical care during her pregnancy. This statement, along with other information gathered during the renewed investigation, was preserved for use in the upcoming trial. According to the authorities, the baby lost its life from asphyxiation shortly after birth. They said, all of a sudden she was in labor giving birth to the baby. The baby came out halfway and then got stuck. She tried to pull the baby out and could not completely deliver the baby. At this point, Nancy lost consciousness. She had no idea how long she was out. She just knew when she came to the baby was delivered. When she picked the baby up, it was blue and not breathing. The state contends that the child might have survived had Nancy sought immediate medical assistance. As a result of the findings, Nancy was charged with open slaying, involuntary manslaughter, and concealing the demise of an individual. Reports indicated that the charge of concealing a demise could potentially be dismissed, but the remaining counts carried severe consequences. The half-niece whose DNA was a match is Jenna Gerwatowski. She received a call while at work. The detective said to her, "Have you heard of the baby Garnet case? Your DNA was a match." About 6 months earlier, her friend had gotten a family tree DNA test for Christmas, and Jenna decided to order her own. DNA from other baby Garnet relatives led the detectives to Jenna's family tree DNA kit. Jenna said her mother, Kara Gerwatowski, started to wonder whether the detective call was a scam. But then Misty Gillis, then a senior forensic genealogist and cold case liaison from Identifinders International, called Jenna that night, but she refused to cooperate. Even though Jenna knew she had nothing to do with the baby Garnet case, she was terrified police would think she was trying to hide something. On June 1st, 2022, the detective spoke with her mother Kara, who agreed to provide her DNA. Kara was the half-sister of baby Garnet. Jenna says the case was always a big mystery in her town. She had no idea the grandmother she had never met could be behind it. If convicted, Nancy faces a possible life sentence in prison. In a public statement, the police authorities acknowledged the perseverance that led to the long-awaited breakthrough. They credited the dedication of multiple generations of investigators who refused to give up on identifying baby Garnet. They said, "Thanks to the incredible efforts of investigators across 3 decades, we are finally able to pursue justice for baby Garnet more than 25 years after her tragic demise." In December 2024, Nancy's attorney argued to the judge that her statements to the investigators should not be allowed to be used as evidence because she had invoked her right to an attorney before questioning. The judge said he would issue his ruling after taking the issue under consideration. Nancy has been released on bond with a GPS tether while awaiting further court proceedings. In February 1992, an 84-year-old woman was found brutally slain in San Diego, California. For more than 25 years, the case remained one of the city's most perplexing cold cases, until advanced DNA technology finally pointed to her perpetrator. Angela Kleinsorge was an 84-year-old retired resident who had lived in the Morena neighborhood of San Diego for many decades. She lived alone in her home on Gaines Street and was described by the police as a long-time, well-known neighbor in a quiet community near Mission Valley. On the morning of March 1st, 1992, Angela's daughter visited her home at 5600 Gaines Street near Linda Vista Road after not hearing from her, and made the devastating discovery. She noticed immediately that something was amiss when she saw the garage light on and the blinds shuttered. Angela had been indecently assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and slain inside her residence the day before. According to San Diego police reports, the evidence suggested that the perpetrator entered the home through a window, and Angela's body showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Angela was born in Germany in 1907. She immigrated to the United States, where she met her husband, Paul. The couple moved to California, started a landscaping business, and raised their family in a modest home. The couple lived the American dream and tried to give back to their community. The Kleinsorges were founding members of the House of Germany at the International Cottages in Balboa Park. Paul passed away in 1971, and Angela continued to live at the family's home, where, as she grew older, she settled into a quiet life. Despite a full investigation in 1992, no suspect was identified. Standard DNA testing at the time failed to match any profiles in crime databases, and the case soon went cold. For more than 2 decades, the case remained unsolved as the investigators and family sought justice. In 2016 to 2017, the investigators revisited the case using a cutting-edge technique called familial DNA testing, which searches databases not just for exact matches, but for close genetic relatives of the unknown suspect. The test produced a lead to a deceased convicted offender's DNA profile. Further investigation revealed that the convict had two brothers, and one of them, Jeffrey Falls, had passed away in a motorcycle crash in 2006 at age 42. The SDPD detectives were able to give the living brother a DNA test, and he was eliminated as a suspect in the cold case. After that, it was time to test Jeffrey. The police obtained a DNA sample from Jeffrey's autopsy tissue and compared it to the evidence from Angela's crime scene, and it matched. The likelihood that Jeffrey was responsible was so high that the investigators considered the identification conclusive. San Diego District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis spoke about the breakthrough. The results of this testing has brought a measure of closure to the victim's family more than 2 decades after her end. SDPD Chief Shelley Zimmerman highlighted the relentless work that led to the identification. This case sat idle for over 2 decades. It would still be unsolved if it was not for the tenacious and persistent efforts of now-retired detective Holly Irwin, who became a reserve detective in order to continue working this case, and also from our crime lab, Adam Dutra. Their relentless pursuit of justice will now allow the Kleinsorge family to close a very painful yet important chapter in their family history. Angela's daughter, Hetty Kleinsorge, reacted emotionally to the news. She said, "When you lose a loved one to a brutal and violent act, and there is no one charged with the crime, you often wonder if the criminal wakes up in the morning, thinks that he got away with ending someone's life, or if he even gives it a second thought. After 25 years, we have our answer. While we have only partial closure, at least we know Mr. Falls no longer thinks he got away with the assault and slaying of our mother. Because Falls was deceased, he was never prosecuted or brought to trial, but DNA evidence strongly implicates him as the perpetrator. At the time of the original investigation in 1992, he had lived across the street from Angela, and police had interviewed him then, but had insufficient evidence to make him a suspect. Another family reflection recorded at the press conference was more somber. To learn that it had been a neighbor, it was just horrifying to us. Angela's case is recognized as an example of how familial DNA testing can solve decades-old cold cases and provide much-needed closure to families long left without answers. On Valentine's Day in 1988, a discovery was made in Butetown, Cardiff, in Wales, United Kingdom. What began as a tragic crime soon erupted into one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in British legal history. Lynette White had grown up in difficult circumstances and, by the age of 20, was working as a prostitute in Cardiff's Docklands. She was described by people who knew her as pretty and popular and was well known in her community. Tim Rogers, a BBC Wales journalist, interviewed Lynette as part of an investigation into child prostitution and said that she was probably the most visible prostitute working in Cardiff at the time, and that she had been trapped in a cycle of exploitation and substance dependency. On the night of February 14, 1988, Lynette's body was found in her flat at 7 James Street, above a bookmaker's in the city's Docklands. She had been stabbed more than 50 times. Her throat was cut, and the attack bore mutilating features, according to forensic experts. The police wanted to give her an arrest warrant, as she was due to be called as a witness for the prosecution in 2 forthcoming trials, and it was later conjectured that she was deliberately lying low to avoid giving evidence. The nature of her wounds led the investigators to conclude that it was an extremely violent and personal attack. Although she had been stabbed 7 times in the heart, it was concluded that it was the throat injury which had ended her life. Shortly after the crime, the police released an e-fit image of a white male seen near the crime scene in blood-stained clothing and believed to be connected to the case. Detective Chief Superintendent John Williams said, "This man almost certainly had the blood of the deceased on him." Despite this, by late 1988, the detectives arrested 5 local men: Stephen Miller, Tony Paris, Yusuf Abdullahi, John Acti, and Ronnie Acti. These arrests were based largely on witness statements and not forensic evidence. There was no scientific evidence linking any of them to the crime scene. In November 1990, after what was then the longest trial in British history, 3 of the accused, Miller, Paris, and Abdullahi, were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But 2 others, John and Ronnie Acti, were acquitted during the trial after spending years in custody. The convictions were highly controversial. There was no forensic evidence, and later appeals showed that some confessions were coerced or unreliable, especially Miller's. In 1992, the Court of Appeal ruled the convictions unsafe and quashed them, releasing the 3 convicted men. Despite their release, the real perpetrator remained at large for years. It was not until advances in DNA technology in the late 1990s and early 2000s that the investigators finally made progress. An expert team re-examined evidence leading to a DNA match for Jeffrey Gaffour, a man who had been a client of Lynette's. In July 2003, Gaffour pleaded guilty. The prosecutors said he admitted, "Just for the record, I did end Lynette White's life. I have been waiting for this for 15 years. Whatever happens to me, I deserve it." He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 13 years before he could be considered for parole. The case continued to generate debate for decades. Several former South Wales police officers were later accused of fabricating or manipulating evidence in the original wrongful convictions. In 2007, 3 of the prosecution witnesses who gave evidence at the original trial were convicted of perjury and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. In 2011, 8 former police officers were charged with conspiring to pervert the course of justice. Their subsequent trial was the largest police corruption trial in British criminal history. Lynette's relatives have described themselves as disheartened and traumatized by the perpetrator's eventual release on prison-day release programs and parole reviews. They said, "We have endured immense suffering in countless ways." The case is seen as emblematic of systemic failures in policing and forensic investigation in the UK. One morning in April 2006, a discovery was made in Camden County, North Carolina, that would lead to a large investigation. As the authorities pieced together the physical and testimonial evidence, a story of fear, retaliation, and irreversible consequence came sharply into focus. In 1975, Elizabeth King met Robert "Bobby" Mansfield at a nightclub in Edenton, North Carolina. The two began dating and eventually became engaged. Their engagement later ended, and they went their separate ways for many years. After almost 3 decades in 2004, Elizabeth returned to Edenton and reconnected with Bobby. Their relationship resumed, even though it had been troubled in the past. On about April 8, 2006, Elizabeth drove to see Bobby at the home he shared with his mother. He had invited her over while his mother was away at the beach, and she agreed to visit because she intended to end the relationship. When Elizabeth arrived, Bobby was in an agitated mood and quickly turned verbally aggressive. Elizabeth stated that he had abused her verbally and physically before, but during this encounter, he spoke to her in ways she said she had never heard from him. Bobby then demanded that she accompany him to a convenience store to cash her monthly child support check, telling her that he needed the money for beer and substances. At the store, Elizabeth resisted and caused a scene, refusing to cash the check. When they returned to the parking lot, Bobby threw beer bottles at her in anger. The two went back to the house afterward. Inside, Bobby prepared a bowl of cereal, and when Elizabeth accidentally bumped into him, he reacted violently. He grabbed her and poured the cereal and milk over her head while cursing at her. During the assault, Bobby told Elizabeth that he was going to take the life of her youngest son, Cameron. Although Bobby had previously spoken about harming other people, this direct threat toward her child shocked her. He then grabbed her by the hair and threw her repeatedly across the room. Elizabeth attempted to leave and tried to gather her belongings in the kitchen, but Bobby knocked her to the floor again and kicked her while she curled into a ball. As a result of the attack, Elizabeth suffered whiplash and a cracked tooth. She eventually managed to get away and drove off. She stopped in an abandoned lot where several police officers approached her vehicle. They escorted her to the station, and Elizabeth filed for a domestic violence protective order. She then called her son Scott, who came to Elizabeth City and drove her back to Edenton. On April 9th, the day after the assault, Bobby contacted Elizabeth again. He invited her to come back for a cookout and suggested she bring Cameron with her. She did not view this as a harmless invitation. Instead, she believed the call was another threat directed toward her son's life. 2 days later, on April 11th, Elizabeth told her son Scott that Bobby had threatened both him and his half-brother, Cameron. The conversation deeply disturbed Scott, and Elizabeth asked him whether they would go to hell if they took him out. From that question, the two formed a plan. Elizabeth suggested that Scott hide in the trunk of her Mercury Grand Marquis so that he could confront Bobby when the moment came. They prepared the vehicle and gathered what they believed they needed. Scott took a baseball bat and Elizabeth took a knife. A blanket was placed in the trunk so Scott could conceal himself. Once the preparations were complete, Scott climbed into the trunk, and Elizabeth drove toward Bobby's house. Over the phone, she invited him to meet with her to get high, convincing him to come with her. They picked him up and drove toward a remote field on Hales Lake Road in Camden County in the early hours of April 12th. Once they arrived at the field, the plan was set into motion. Scott jumped out of the trunk and confronted Bobby with the baseball bat. Elizabeth stabbed Bobby in the back with a knife. After stabbing him, she told Scott to finish him off. Scott struck Bobby repeatedly in the head with the baseball bat. Bobby collapsed, at which point Scott removed the knife and stabbed him additional times while he lay on the ground motionless. After the assault, Elizabeth and Scott gathered the blanket and both weapons. They disposed of the items in a river and returned to clean the vehicle the next morning. Meanwhile, Bobby's body was discovered and reported to the police on the morning of April 12th. Special Agent Christopher Conway arrived at the scene and began documenting evidence, including shoe and tire impressions pressed into the ground. He noted a rounded indentation in the soil that was consistent with the end of a baseball bat. An examination of Bobby's body showed 5 stab wounds to his back and left shoulder. Additionally, his skull had been shattered into fragments, with small pieces of tissue and matter scattered around his head. The investigators collected tire impressions and later matched them to the tires on Elizabeth's vehicle. As the investigation progressed, both physical and testimonial evidence began to align. Scott gave a statement explaining the events leading up to the crime. He described finding his mother distraught on April 11th and her claim that Bobby had threatened him and Cameron. Scott confirmed that Elizabeth asked him whether they would go to hell if they took action and explained how the ambush was planned. His testimony matched the forensic findings at the scene, providing the investigators with a narrative that supported the physical evidence collected in the field. With both Scott's testimony and the forensic evidence matching, the investigators moved forward with criminal charges. On August 30th, Scott was arrested in connection with Bobby's case, and Elizabeth was arrested shortly afterward. A grand jury in Camden County formally indicted both Elizabeth and Scott for first-degree slaying on October 23rd. This indictment replaced earlier charges in which Elizabeth had initially been booked only as an accessory after the fact. But as the investigation progressed, the authorities elevated the charge to first-degree slaying. The case proceeded to trial in October 2008 in Camden County Superior Court. On October 16, 2008, a jury found Elizabeth guilty of under theories of lying in wait and premeditation. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Elizabeth later appealed her conviction, challenging the admission of evidence and arguing that the proof presented was insufficient. But in February 2010, the North Carolina Court of Appeals denied the appeal and upheld the conviction.